Okay, so when we finished on Friday, and I'm just picking this back up, I'm going to talk about different muscles now, getting into specific muscles. What you want to pay attention to as I say the names of these muscles, where does it fit into our naming convention? Is the action in the name? Is the shape, the direction of the fibers? How many muscle heads exist? Um, and I'll try to point that out as I lecture on the different muscles. Um, this general picture, like I said, you're not going to have to label this picture, but cutaneous muscles, remember cutaneous is pertaining to skin. So these muscles are typically found under the skin. Remember, you have epidermis, dermis, hypodermis, fat. Underneath that fat then would be these muscles. But they're typically very superficial, thin. They're usually found, and some of them have a little bit of attachment to the bones, some not as much. But let me get into what some of these do. Now, obviously, what I would do is I would look at this picture and then I would look at the ones that I need to know from that list on the study guide. And I'm going to try to stress now. And another thing, when you look at muscle images, I'm going to send you guys, there's some videos that I normally show in class. They are from dissection. Hopefully that doesn't bother anyone. We're going to be doing, hopefully doing dissection and anatomy too. I'm going to work on a plan for that, because normally the last week of next term, we do cat dissection. We spend 3 days dissecting. What you'll notice is muscles lie and interweave between each other. And there's a video that shows them kind of isolating muscles. A couple of them are foreign and don't even have narration, but they have the name of the muscle, and they're pretty good videos. So I will try to get those sent out to you. But you'll see that they're kind of interwoven here. When we get into muscles of the head and neck area, is typically, obviously, they control the ears, the lips, for facial expression, obviously enable mastication because they are attached to the mandible. So one of the ones you needed to know was the masseter muscle. Masseter, mastication. Mastication is chewing. So if I go back to this picture, you can see here's the masseter muscle, which is up on the cheek area. It is attached, it inserts here under the zygomatic arch, and it attaches, and its insertion is the mandible. So what happens is when that muscle shortens its length, remember, it doesn't come in the middle, insertion is going to move towards origin. That's how the muscle moves the jaw up and down. Also, it allows for translation of the jaw. Okay, but the masseter is the primary muscle of chewing. Sensory structures like moving the ears, blinking, and actually giving support to the head. Some muscles don't have a lot of movement. Sometimes they're just for support. If we're talking about raising the head and neck, one of the muscles we needed to know was the trapezius. Now, if you look up here, the trapezius is right here, and it looks like a trapezoid. My friend and I come up with weird things. When I had to learn this in school, muscles are difficult. My friend and I studied like all weekend for this test. We were like studying. Trapezius, I kind of thought trapezius or a trapeze and them holding, and I said it is supportive of the head and neck, but I think about supporting myself on a trapeze. And we came up with like little songs to remember it. So the trapezius here raises the head and neck. So what happens is we have origin here, we have insertion here, and when it pulls, it's going to take that head and raise it. You can imagine how that action would work. If we're talking about brachiocephalicus, brachiocephalicus is named for origin and insertion. It's going to extend the head and neck and pull the front leg forward. So here's brachiocephalicus, all right? brachium, cephalicus, head. So you can see origin and insertion. But what we're talking about here is extend the head and neck and pull the leg forward. If you think about it originating, insertion, and if it pulls, it's going to kind of do like this motion. It's kind of pulling it up, but it's also kind of pulling it forward. Again, going towards one of the homework charts, the homework in the lab book, if you haven't looked at it yet, is literally charts: muscle, origin, insertion, action. You should always be able to figure out that the muscle is going to take the insertion site and always move it more towards origin. And if it's connecting two bones, it's going to affect that joint. Extend, flex, adduct, or abduct. When I talked about the 4 actions that it can have on a limb, it's either going to adduct it, abduct it, flex it, or extend it. But it always pulls from insertion more towards the origin site. And then flexion of the head and neck is sternocephalicus. And this is origin insertion name. If I go back, flexing the head and neck, here's sternocephalicus. That kind of goes underneath here. It attaches at the sternum, origin insertion, inserts at the cephalicus. Now the sternum isn't going to come up towards the head. It's going to take the head and it says flex, because the muscle is going to pull insertion towards origin, which is the sternum. If I do that, if I pull my head towards my sternum, that's going to cause flexion. Okay. So again, if I asked you, do I find the sternocephalicus muscle near the hip joint? Well, I have sternum and cephalicus. That is nowhere near the hip. Okay, so naming, origin, and insertion is also reviewing where your bones are located. So I would make sure you go back in. Most of the tests should still be open for you to look at for feedback. So hopefully you can see, you know, which bones you need to review. Okay. Now, when we get into the muscles of the abdomen, obviously they're mostly for support. So they're going to layer, but they're also, when muscles contract, you're going to flex the back. When they relax, you're going to extend the back. So they pull, relax, flex, and it's bending that back. Obviously, urination, defecation, parturition is giving birth. Parturition is giving birth. So obviously the abdominal muscles contract. Vomiting. Now regurgitation is a little more of a passive movement. It's kind of like they burp up fluid, but when someone, most people have vomited before, you get that, it's like you get that retching, where a lot of times regurgitation is kind of just like a bleh. It's, animals do it sometimes. I used to have a chemotherapy patient, and this dog, I'd be holding it, talking to my boss, and you would just hear bleh and splat on the floor. I didn't hear that whole, like, if an animal's going to vomit, like my cats, all of a sudden I'm like, oh God, I hear it. And I'm running and running. I'm like, okay, where are they vomiting? Regurgitation can just be a very quick movement. But the other thing is they have a role in respiration. When an animal goes to exhale, there is a little bit of an abdominal push. And what that does is it also pushes on the diaphragm, decreases the thorax, and that's how an animal exhales. Inhalation is primarily the chest cavity, the ribs, and the diaphragm. Exhalation has an abdominal component where they push. So I do want you to know there are, I said abdominal muscles on the study guide. Abdominal muscles are named for their direction. You have, usually for the obliques, you have external and internal. Obviously, externals would be the first ones that you would see. Internals are underneath. Oblique means an angle. So the abdomen, if this is the abdomen up and down, okay, oblique muscles, there's going to be 2 layers. but they go on an angle. They meet at that aponeurosis in the middle. So the abdominal obliques come together and attach at the linea alba, which is the aponeurosis. Now, rectus abdominis goes long ways. Okay, rectus is the long abdominal muscles. And there are pairs. There are ones on the right and left side. So there's a right and left obliques. There's right and left rectus. And then transverse is the opposite angle. It's perpendicular to midline. So transverse abdominis muscles all come together at the linea alba. So oblique, rectus, transverse. Oblique, rectus, transverse. Could make like a cheer out of that or something. And I want you to know they join at the linea. Now, the thoracic limb, the forelimb, those muscles of the limb are primarily for locomotion or movement. Let me get my, sorry, I'm trying to get my study guide in front of me a second here. Okay, so when we get into these, we're talking about moving the forelimb. There are superficial and deep muscles everywhere, okay? The superficial muscles, when we talk about the adductors, if I'm an adductor, remember, I'm adding the limb back to the body. I'm pulling the limb towards midline. Latissimus dorsi is one. Let me go back to the picture. Now, latissimus are kind of known in people, your lats. You take that machine and you go like this, and you're working your lats. Think about kind of lateral, and they have a dorsi or a dorsal attachment. Latissimus dorsi has a dorsal attachment. Now, obviously, is the back going to go towards the forelimb? No. When latissimus dorsi contracts, it's going to pull the brachium towards dorsum, okay? If I do this, you can also do this kind of exercise because it's going to flex the shoulder, okay? By pulling towards origin, which is my back, you naturally flex the shoulder or pull the forelimb caudal. By pulling the forelimb caudal, it also pulls it a little bit closer to the body. So it is still classified as an adductor because it's pulling it back, but kind of pulling it in. So your name is right there. Pectorals. The pectorals, obviously we know pecs are right up here. Okay, there's a superficial and deep pectoral on your sheet. I have both listed. Oopsie. Sorry. Pectorals are deep here, but most of the pectorals, what they do is they originate, sorry, my scarf's in the way. They originate at the sternum, they insert at the brachium, okay? But what they do is they adduct the limbs, pull towards the sternum. So they are adductors. This is the machine if you go like this, okay? Pectorals are taking the forelimb and adding them back to the body. The sternum isn't going to go like this, okay? Origin, insertion, pull towards origin. Natural reaction is an adductor. And there is superficial and deep. Oops, okay. So we've got those. I took off deltoids as one of the muscles to know, but that is another adductor muscle. Now, when we go into the brachial muscles, which are up here, okay, they are flexor and extensors. We have biceps brachii and triceps brachii. On your paper, I have listed triceps brachii. Okay, biceps are here, triceps are here. So if you think about this, the way they're going to pull the limb is they can extend this limb. They can also pull, and by doing that, they can flex the shoulder. So some of the muscles that you will look up on your chart can have two different actions. They can be flexors and extensors. They might flex one, but by doing that extends another joint. So I just kind of showed you when this muscle contracts, it's going to pull the olecranon this way. It extends the angle, but sometimes with that action, we could get flexion of the shoulder. And the triceps, the naming convention here is location, brachii, forelimb, triceps, 3 heads. So the triceps has 3 branches. They all narrow to a tendon, but they have 3 muscle heads that come together at one location. Now, carpal and digital muscles, we're speaking of wrist and we're speaking of the digits, like our fingers, their little toes. The one that I have on your paper is extensor carpi radialis. And I will literally get people tell me this is a muscle of flexion. Extensor is in the name. So what happens is extensor carpi radialis is on the anterior or dorsal surface of the antebrachium. But what it's going to do is when that muscle contracts, we have origin at the proximal radius ulna, we have insertion at the carpus and the digits. So when it contracts, it's going to extend the carpus and partially extend the digits. Now, when you look at a picture of the forelimb muscles, there are a lot, okay? So I'm just explaining one. There's many different muscles that will extend the carpus and the digits, but this is a primary extensor carpi radialis, carpus radius. So this is not a forelimb or a hind limb muscle. This is a forelimb muscle because the radius and the carpus is on the forelimb, and their job is to extend. Now, the deep digital flexors I did not have on your sheet, but they are below, and they pull towards origin, flexing the digits. So that would be a flexor. Extensor, flexor. So the extensors are usually found dorsal or anterior. Flexors are usually found caudal or posterior. So they pull this way versus this way. Okay, and so we get into the hind limb. Now, there are some hind limb or pelvic limb muscles that are kind of important, especially when you get into injections. So I'm gonna work my way down. If we're going up from the hip down, okay, the gluteals, which would be your rump, we got our glutes back here, but they are extensors. So what they do is they will originate up at the hip, they will insert, and there's different ones there. So the gluteals, but what they'll do is they'll pull the back leg, they'll contract towards the hip, and by that doing it extends the hind limb. Okay, so if the glutes are up here and they attach to the limb, when they pull towards the top of the glute, if you think about a horse and the big, they kind of got that big rump, horses in the back, those big muscles on top are the gluteals, the gluteal group, which I'm not breaking down into different parts, but I don't even have the gluteals listed as one of the groups to know, but they are up at the time they pull towards the hip, extend the hind limb. Now the hamstring group is important to know. Hamstring, because normally in class I'm saying this is going to be embarrassing, but we're talking about, you can't see, here's back here, your caudal thigh. Wow. Okay. That is the hamstrings on the back. Now you have a biceps femoris. I have that listed on there. So there's a biceps brachii and there's a biceps femoris. Femoris meaning femur. So the biceps are basically on the side of the thigh, okay? So the biceps are here, and they're on the lateral thigh. We're gonna talk now about the semimembranosus and tendinosus. You need to know membranosus and tendinosus are the muscles of injection. When you give an IM injection to an animal, well, dogs and cats, I'll talk about cattle and pigs and stuff, but when you use the back leg of a dog or a cat, you are injecting into the membranosus and the tendinosus muscle. Let me see. Okay, so on this horse picture here, okay, you see got my gluteal group here, okay? I've got quadriceps up here, but see how biceps is kind of like it goes glutes, biceps femoris, quadriceps are your cranial thigh, like from your knee up to your hip on the front of your leg, that area, that is your quadriceps. On the side would be your biceps. If you go to the back, this is where we're talking about the semimembranosus and tendinosus. Now, when we go to give an injection, we don't use this muscle in horses, but because I have this horse picture, I'll show you. You're going to grab this back group here, and you're going to inject going caudally. Probably if I had something I could show. My dog's sleeping upstairs. But basically what we're going to do is we grab the back leg, and you always want to point caudal right in between those muscles. And during dissection, we find this. There is the sciatic nerve. The sciatic nerve originates, it's a branch, comes down from the spinal cord, and it goes in between those muscles. And it's very important during an injection that you don't put your needle the way that arrow is pointing. If you point in and you hit that nerve, it's kind of like if you bump your elbow, and if you've ever hit that nerve and all of a sudden your arm, you're like, it's tingly, you feel like you can't use it for a second. I did this in high school. I was working for a vet, gave a shot, brought a dog in the back. I give it, and I wasn't pointing like in, but the dog jumped, and my needle shoved in, and the dog cried out, and then all of a sudden he's holding his leg up. And I'm thinking, this is before I went to tech school, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I've broke this dog, I'm gonna get fired. And my boss is like, okay, well, go tell the owner, we're just gonna observe him for a little bit. What I did was just nicked that nerve. And within about an hour, the dog, hour and a half, started putting his leg down. It just kind of stunned the nerve. I didn't cause any permanent damage. He ended up walking out of the building. But, that's why you're taught when you give that injection to always point caudal. We kind of grab the muscle bellies together, and we give it away from the nerve. So semimembranosus and tendinosus are muscles of injection. Those are muscles of injection. So that is important to know. Now, when we get into muscles of the tarsus and digits, so we're working our way down the limb, okay? Now, let me go back. Sorry, muscles of the stifle. The quadriceps muscles. I just told you, if this is the knee, okay, tibia and fibula would be down here, okay? So here's the knee. Here is the femur. The quadriceps are here. The quadriceps are going to insert at a couple different sites near the stifle, but when they contract, they're going to pull towards origin, and they're going to extend the stifle, okay? So typically when the quadriceps contract, the quadriceps will pull, and then this would be the front of the leg, and that would extend, okay? So not my wrist, pretending this is the knee or the stifle. This is the femur. This is the tibia and fibula. Extend. And then I added onto your picture, to your list to know, is the gastrocnemius. Now, the gastrocnemius is every once in a while there's a name of a muscle that doesn't go by any of the clues I gave you. Numbers, name, insertion. Gastroc is just a name to know, but it is important. Let me go back. Okay, here is the hock. Right here, that band of tissue is the Achilles tendon. The gastrocnemius is underneath, so it's lower than your semimembranosus and tendinosus, and it tends to go a little medial on the hind limb. So it kind of comes up here and goes in here. But the very end of the gastrocnemius is the Achilles tendon. When the gastrocnemius contracts, so here's a muscle, if you imagine it's in here, it's going to pull insertion, which is the calcanean tuberosity. When that muscle shortens, that's naturally going to extend the hock. So hopefully you can imagine how with this would pull, oh, I guess I'm pointing and you can't see me with my finger. Here is the Achilles, it's going to pull towards origin. That action is going to extend the hock or the tarsus. So I do want you to know what's important about the gastroc is that it forms the terminal end of the gastrocnemius, forms the Achilles tendon. The Achilles tendon is attached to the calcanean tuberosity. Gastroc pulls that calcanean tuberosity towards origin. By nature, that's going to extend the hock or extend the tarsus. Okay. Now, I get into this a little bit more in depth when we talk about the respiratory system next term. But one thing to know is the lungs inside your thorax are completely passive. Okay, they're like sponges of air-filled cavities, and they do not move themselves. They are like laying there inside your thorax. Your thorax is a big cavity of negative pressure. So what happens is when your thoracic muscles, the thoracic muscles are in between the ribs. I don't have them listed to know, but in between each rib are the intercostals. If anybody likes to go out and have ribs, baby back ribs, you're eating intercostal muscles. Sorry for if you vegetarians are out there listening to me. Okay, so there's two sets, external and internal intercostals. When they contract, they take your rib cage, okay, and they make it bigger. They make your thorax bigger. When they do, the lungs are kind of chilling inside and they go, oh, I can stretch. And when your lungs expand with the thorax, that's how air is pulled in. The act of inhalation within the lungs is passive. It is not active. Contraction of the thorax is active, okay? So when an animal inhales, the diaphragm contracts. Remember, the diaphragm splits the thorax and the abdomen, the front half and the back half of the body, okay? When the diaphragm contracts, it's going to pull the thorax, the ribs are going to contract, and the thorax gets bigger. The lungs passively will inflate because all of a sudden the space got bigger. Air comes in. When it's time to exhale, okay, basically the internal intercostals are going to pull the ribs like this, and then your abdominal muscles are going to push. And then what happens is the diaphragm goes back to normal. The size of the thorax is decreased. The lungs are like, oh boy, they get squeezed and the animal exhales. So I do want you to be able to tell me the muscles of respiration, which I did not list on your muscle study guide because there are various muscles, but I would add to know, which you would tell me diaphragm, intercostals, and abdominal muscles. You can just say abdominal muscles because they all have a role. I'm not going to have you list, rectus, transverse, oblique. You would just say abdominal muscles. And again, when we get into the respiratory system, I will talk about that more in depth. What I will also be sending out is I have a small PowerPoint that is individual pictures of some of the muscles I want you to know. So it's kind of like a separate PowerPoint. I usually go through it when we go through the homework, because I literally go through every picture and go, where's the origin? Where's the insertion? What's the action? So we will go through that. A little bit of what is actually happening in a muscle fiber. Okay, how does a muscle contract? Okay, this whole big thing up here is a muscle belly, or what I've been talking about. You can see the muscle narrows to a tendon. Inside, okay, there is what's called a myofibril. That is the interior of a muscle fiber itself. Myofibril literally means muscle fiber. They have multi-nuclei, so they have multiple nuclei within this cell, this muscle fiber, muscle cell, and they are a series of tubules. Okay, so all these muscle fibers form tubules. They're all connected, and then they all make up that muscle belly. So we're looking at what is happening with one. That's how we're going to explain. If it happens to one muscle fiber, it's going to happen to all of these muscle fibers. What you're going to get is there is a network of sarcoplasmic reticulum. So a sarcomere is a series of filaments that make up that contrail unit. Many sarcomeres line up to make one fiber. Okay, think about this for a second, like a can. This looks to me like a can, okay? If I took 4 soup cans and lined them up, think of them like 4 of these contractile units, okay? And then 4 of those cans, if I line them up, they make like one. Then that is going to be, if I line up 1 can as 1 sarcomere, if I line up 4 sarcomeres or 4 cans, they make 1 fiber. So think about these little cylinders like a sarcomere, and then you line them up end on end, and they make 1 myofibril. And then many myofibrils are joined together to make the whole muscle. So what we're doing is we're kind of pulling it apart one by one and looking at one. If I go to the next slide, is basically, here it is, this picture, you've got a whole muscle fasciculus, which is kind of like a muscle belly. They're going to pull out one piece of muscle fiber, which is this, and then they're going to pull out part of that muscle fiber, and here is a myofibril. Imagine this as 1, 2, 3, 4 soup cans put together. It's my best analogy I can come up with. If I look at what is the component of one of these sarcomeres, okay, they have bands, A bands, H bands, I bands, Z bands. I'm not going to stress that. Let me look at the next picture. Okay, this is a bigger picture. So here we're breaking it down, fasciculus, muscle belly, muscle fiber. Within that muscle fiber are all, think like little straws or sarcomeres. This sarcomere lines up to make, and one of them is a series of 2 things called actin and myosin. Actin and myosin, oops, sorry, let me go back. What happens here is myosin is in the middle. Think myosin middle, MM. Actin fibers are on the outside. When a muscle contracts, the actin fibers pull towards the myosin in the middle. If you can imagine what happens, if each of these sarcomeres get shorter, that whole muscle fiber gets shorter. Does that make sense? Hopefully it does. Okay, so each sarcomere, actin fibers are going to pull towards myosin. If this one, this one, this one, this one, if they all get shorter, the net reaction is that a muscle contracts. And what a muscle contraction is that all of those muscle fibers, all of those individual sarcomeres are shortening. Therefore, the whole muscle gets shorter. That is how a muscle contracts. And if I go here, I've told you the nervous system controls the muscles. Whether it is the somatic nervous system, your brain controlling your skeletal muscles, or your, this also can happen autonomically or automatically. What happens is you have a nerve attached to the muscles. All muscles are innervated, means they all have nerve supply. Remember when I talked about a nerve depolarizes, it sends a signal. Okay, me touching the stove, okay? Hot stove sends a signal to my brain says it's hot, move your hand. It sends a signal down this yellow thing right here, which is the axon of a motor nerve, okay? That signal is going to send a neurotransmitter that is stored at the end of, remember the teledendrons and the synaptic knobs? There is a neurotransmitter in there called acetylcholine. When the brain sends a signal to the motor nerve, it releases acetylcholine into the postsynaptic membrane, which is my muscle cells. When acetylcholine goes into those muscles, it's going to trigger the calcium channels to open and contract the muscle. Therefore, I move my hand. So the neuromuscular junction is the nerve's connection to the muscle, literally. And that is how the nerves are connected, okay, to the muscle. If you don't understand that concept, let me know or type something, but the presynaptic terminal is your motor nerve connecting. The postsynaptic membrane is the muscle of the nerve that it is trying to tell to move. And the neurotransmitter, remember, is the chemical messenger. Acetylcholine enters the muscle cell. Acetylcholine is going to trigger a reaction with calcium in the muscle cell, and then calcium is what initiates, but it starts with acetylcholine, which is how the signal gets from the presynaptic membrane to the postsynaptic membrane. And that's that wave of depolarization that gets sent from the brain. Okay. We don't need to know motor unit for the test. Let me stop there because I think I've filled brains enough. What I want to do is, let me put a pause here for a second.